I introduce Abigail, who's going to be talking about ventilation rates in hospitality.
Thanks, Henry. So I think Tim's introduction actually works quite well for this talk as well. So it's been put together really well. The aim of this work was to try and understand what's the state of ventilation in small and medium scale hospitality venues. The title of my talk was Measuring Ventilation Rates in Hospitality Venues. I noticed after talking to Henry, he glossed over this a bit because I was explaining earlier, we haven't really quantified ventilation rates, so this is a misnomer. We have been measuring CO2, which I will report, looking at how the challenges around using that to calculate ventilation rates in a, I guess, sort of quite a quick study, and I'll explain why that's the case later. And importantly, I've sort of updated the title to adding and improving, because really the reason we want to measure this is to understand if we need improvements. And the question is, if you need improvements, how do you improve? I think in hospitality, this is particularly interesting because as a sector, this work was funded through COVID funding through the Protect National Core Study. So, it's thinking about the fact these are places where strangers get together. There's an important risk of transmission there out to lots of different people in the community. But as a sector, now these businesses, but a lot of them have gone under. A lot of them are really struggling. About 1 in 3 have no cash reserves. Moving into the winter with energy costs, it's a difficult sector to be in. They are struggling. And, I think potentially we know ventilation may not have been considered in a lot of these venues, but actually, what are they going to do about it? How can they manage this when they're working on a knife edge, basically? So hospitality is interesting from that point of view. And I've completely lost track of my thoughts there. So in a challenging sector to understand what you can do, which is why our work as a company is involved both measuring ventilation, but seeing how can we improve things both technically and behaviourally, and what are the specific challenges. And I just want to point out Sheffield City Council are funding a follow-on study, and we're really heavily involved in helping out with the study we're doing. We couldn't have done it without them in terms of helping us access these venues. So the aim of this work was to assess the technical and behavioural barriers to good ventilation in small and medium scale hospitality. And I think that scale is quite important. There's not a lot of work in this sector at all. It covers a vast range of different types of venues, and we've only touched the surface really. Hospitality itself is the 3rd biggest employer. So again, looking forward beyond COVID, this was work around COVID, but thinking about health altogether. Looking at a lot of the talks today about occupational health, there's a lot of workers in these sectors, a high proportion of women and ethnic minorities as well. And something I've been very aware of in going out and around, increased amounts of cleaning in the spaces, different types of pollutants in different venues for atmospheric effects, or as I said, cleaning following COVID. So I think there's going forward this interest in ventilation and how we can improve it is important for that occupational health as well as infectious disease transmission. And this work really started with Sheffield City Council, Ian Ashmore, the head of environmental health, getting in touch and saying, please, can you help? Because we're going out and doing these sort of COVID safety checks, and it's fine with the cleaning and the distancing, but we just haven't got a clue when it comes to ventilation. So a big part of this work was to try and understand what ventilation is like, how we can improve it. At the same time, trying to get a sense of how can we advise environmental health officers, if they're going to do a walk around survey, or what they can look for and how they can judge the ventilation, and then ultimately how they can help advise the businesses, because although they're there for regulation, the local council, you want to keep these businesses going, you want to help them to do the right thing. So that's a lot of the driver behind what we're doing. So what we were doing was walk around surveys where we'd look at the ventilation provision, CO2 monitoring to understand that provision of outdoor air per person, did look at could we calculate air change rates. I'll talk a bit about that. And then we had interviews. If you're into the sort of psychology side of things, we're looking at the COM-B model. So we're looking at the capabilities, opportunities and motivations for making those changes. And I've just given a sort of overview of the type of venues we're looking at. I said that small to medium scale. So not a lot of work in this area. I think the biggest sort of study around events and hospitality would be the events research programme, but that was much bigger events. These are quite small scale. Our restaurants, most of them were around 40 to 50 seats. That's the maximum capacity of people shown on the right. Our nightclubs were less than 2,000. You know, the one in events research program is 6,000. So quite a different scale. So you're really looking at that sort of smaller scale businesses. And I guess another point I should make here is this work was done December to March. So Omicron hit just as we were starting this. Another challenge for these businesses who were already struggling. Suddenly people were not necessarily wanting to go to keep people safe. So that's the maximum capacity of the venues. In a lot of cases, they were operating at lower capacity and had social distancing in place. Just a quick note, because I did say the title was about ventilation rates, but I'm not showing it, just CO2. But we were considering how we could quickly gather occupancy data, because 4 months project, we're trying to get a view of what is the ventilation like? Is it good, bad? Is it really terrible? How worried should we be? So we're trying to look at a lot of venues. Doing occupancy studies was just something we had to write off. We did a bit of going in and doing spot checks, which was fine in the smaller venues, cafes, restaurants, but in a nightclub with 1,000 people, not possible. We're hoping to gather information from the venues who often said there was stuff available, but getting that out of them was basically impossible. So we did do a little look at using the Google Live occupancy data. So Google Live tells you how busy a venue is, and you have historic data with these little charts telling you what it's like on different days of the week. It also sometimes has this live data, so whether it thinks it's busy or not. And I think just a little sort of methodological thing here that might be of interest is that we found that in some cases this actually could work quite well to give us a sense of how busy places were. So it just tells you, on how busy a venue is as a proportion of its maximum capacity. So you need that maximum capacity from the venue owners. But you also need to know what it's been recently, because that maximum is based on their data, so it will reset every couple of weeks. So in our case, with everything operating at a lower capacity, you'd have to use that number. And what these charts show here is our CO2 readings. And then this is when the venue's open, with the blue bars showing us 0 to 100%. Now, this venue here, the other thing Google tells you, and you can also get from the venue owners, is how much time do people spend there. There's one on the left is a restaurant, a lot of Deliveroo type deliveries, but also a lot of people coming in to collect their takeaway, as well as being a restaurant. The one on the other side, so these two charts are a quiet day and a busy day in the same venue. So we've got two venues here. Again, a quiet day and a busy day, but this venue is somewhere that just has people coming and sitting in. So we've got one venue where you have lots of people coming and going, and some people staying there. One venue where people tend to sit there and only to come in and spend, an hour, 2 hours there. So, when we first looked at this first venue, you can see, if you think about CO2 readings, and knowing this venue, the ventilation wouldn't have changed during this time. That's another story. You can see if you look at the CO2 readings and assume you can infer some kind of occupancy from that versus Google, it's pretty much completely off. Whereas if you look at the venue, where again, knowing how they operated it, you're not going to have a change in that ventilation. So I think CO2 could give an inference on how the occupancy is changing. We get a much better sort of tracking along the occupancy numbers to the CO2. So it feels like it's giving you a closer match. I think where you have venues where people come and sit down, and then there's that live occupancy data can give you a bit of a sense of how things change over time. Obviously, big room of uncertainty there, bit of sort of time slippage as well, but I think there is sort of an opportunity for that to be used in certain times of venues, particularly if you can spot check for a few points in time, and you can make sure you know what your maximum is going to be. So moving on to what we saw in terms of the ventilation in these venues. So we looked at 21 different venues, and they're not all shown here. They'll be shown on the other chart. There were restaurants, cafes, bar, nightclubs, and gyms. So I haven't shown gyms on this just because of space, and I thought I'd stick to that more. Actually, what's really hospitality. Another story of why we included gyms. So it's the first time I've shown this chart in public, and I'm hoping it's going to make sense to people. So we've got each listed restaurants along here, cafes, bars, and nightclubs. A sort of block is one venue. So one venue, different venue, different venue. So we've got 7 restaurants there. Each line is a day in that venue, and that is a day that they are open. So that represents the opening time. So this is only data when the venues were open. Something we struggled with in trying to interpret this data is that some venues would be open a lot of the week, some venues would be only open for short periods. And then trying to look at how do we bring this data together, particularly if you're looking at averaging. You know, max, we felt that only gives us the maximum. We average, even if it's over opening time. In some places, it might have really bad ventilation, but it is only at capacity for one night of the week. But it's open all the time with barely anyone in there. So getting that balance is quite tricky. So that's the aim of this visualization, is to kind of understand this a bit more. So this is the time that it's open on those days. So that's why some of them have more bars and others they just are open more in our study period. And what the colours are showing is where it's green, that's the percentage of open areas under 800 parts per million. So we're looking at the SAGE guidance and what we should be aiming for. So, you know, like 10 to 12 litres per second per person then in theory in that venue. So if you look at cafes here, we have there that's sort of about a third of the time. It's actually below on that first day, 800 parts per million. Then this colour that's supposed to be amber, but not really, is between 800 and 1500 parts per million, so where you want to be looking for improvements, and then red is when it's over 1500 parts per million. What I've also shown on here is these stars where the venues had mechanical supply and extract, so centralised systems, and the little triangles upside down are where they just had extract systems. That seems to be quite common in a lot of these venues. Everything else is naturally ventilated. And so I think some things to see here is that, unsurprisingly, as you get into the more crowded venues, the bars and the nightclubs, you're seeing more of that red colour coming through. And I think that reflects both that you've got a greater density of people, but I think the other important thing that we saw here is noise legislation is critical to these places. They will be shut down if they break noise legislation. And to do something quick to ventilate is going to make you break noise legislation. You know, there are bigger long-term things you can do spending money. Anything quick is an issue around noise. So there's basically very little they can do. There are a couple of places that do pretty well. Now, these venues are mechanically ventilated, but you can also see there's a couple of other mechanically ventilated venues that didn't do so well. And I think what we have here, these two venues in the middle, probably slightly outside that description of businesses I was saying earlier. So these are small venues, but they are part of a bigger organisation that would have had building and estates people within it. So in terms of that longer term maintenance and expertise within the bigger organisation, it would be there. Whereas the ones on the far right, when we went to look at these systems, it was quite clear they hadn't had much care done to them in years. In one case, their system was at least a decade older than me. I'm not telling you how old I am. But it was from the 70s. So I think unsurprisingly here, we are seeing various red things, quite a lot of amber. Interesting, a lot of the restaurants actually managed quite well, but we particularly saw this in places where they could naturally ventilate and there were easily things to open. They could manage it, they could get what to do. And I think there the challenge is really thermal comfort going forwards. Just to look at the data a bit more in terms of, this was the worst day. So again, trying to look at how we compare the time, shows a similar sort of data. Some values getting very high in the nightclubs. The one that goes up to 10,000, we do suspect there might be an issue there with something else happening in the space that isn't people's breath. And we've been digging into this, trying to figure out what's going on, but haven't quite got an answer yet. But having seen the systems in the place, that's surprising. We'd have expected it to be more alongside the other ones, so maybe up to the sort of 3,000 to 5,000, but that seems pretty high to get up to 10,000. Other air quality implications of places came up to quite interesting things. So we did have one of our early venues was a cafe, and this is my attempt of drawing a plan view of the building, which is a city centre, multi-storey car park, and then around the base there are retail outlets. We looked at a cafe on the corner to start with, and there were some other venues along the side of it which didn't pay much attention to. They weren't interested in our study. And what, you don't need to look at this plot in detail, but what we found was that we were getting some peaks in the night, and we thought, oh, that's interesting. And we gave everyone feedback sheets. So in this one, we said, you might want to just check everything in your kitchen, maybe something switching on that's creating CO2, and maybe just check nothing's malfunctioning. I'm not sure what that is. And then a later venue was on the other side. And again, these one really got the peaks in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., always the highest values, 3 a.m. And, I was like, well, is this, it's a daytime restaurant. Are they doing, nighttime meals on the side that we shouldn't know about? Are they not within their license? What's happening? And the research, like, no, we figured it out. There's a nightclub between these two. There's a smoking area from the nightclub is within this car park area, and we're pretty sure that there's an exchange of air between these different venues, and we expect that's what the high levels in the cafe was. One of our other venues is in a bigger space with connected, I guess, internally by air flats, and again, there we saw increase in CO2 outside the occupied period for that venue, and that sort of exchange of air between venues is clearly something here. Not a risk in terms of COVID because it's going into those areas when no one's there, but it's a car park. There's a lot of other pollutants in there which are potentially being dragged in this area. And in terms of occupational health for people working in there for long periods of time, that's a risk. So just to give an overview of some of our typical recommendations in these places to the owners, in any case where there's a system, the extracts in particular often, weren't really working. In one case, I didn't know where the on switch was. That really wasn't working. Our sort of first advice was basically to get an engineer in to review the system, see if anything needed any upgrade, and to then make sure they're implementing clear maintenance regimes and implementing a clear plan of operation. And one of the venues, very keen guy owning it, knew it was really important to look at ventilation. We turned up when he was in business, people sat down eating in his face and said, so what's your current ventilation? So, oh, do you want me to switch it on? Well, yes, I think that would be our first advice. Have this switched on when you're in the space. And that was clear across a few spaces where they were only using it occasionally. It's interesting, we commented about CO2 monitors earlier from Tim. We actually felt that where CO2 monitors would be useful here would be in a lot of the naturally ventilated spaces which are doing quite well to help them manage thermal comfort, to know, so they weren't having to over ventilate, and particularly as we move into this winter as well, so they know sort of what they're achieving. We did speak to some venues who had CO2 monitors who said, well, it's fine, but it tells me it's really bad and I don't know what to do. And I think particularly with the bars, the problem, they can't do anything. Oops, that's on the wrong way. Just a quick thing about barriers, because Henry's sitting on the edge of his seat. Anyone coming next week, Sophie's going to talk more about this, but we did find that there's a complete lack of useful guidance for these people. Anyone that's seen it, any guidance, felt it wasn't appropriate for them. They weren't able to make changes because of money or responsibility. And ventilation was only really a priority when it was a priority for their customers. And in most places, noise legislation was a higher priority. So where people perceived that they had a vulnerable customer base who wanted higher ventilation, then they ventilated. Many of our venues having atmospheric smoke was important, and also for some of the punkier venues with the gigs, being sweaty is a part of that experience, and they didn't want to remove it. So thank you very much for listening. I'll leave the summary up there. It's overrun.
Love the idea of you walking around punky venues with your CO2 monitors. Does anyone have any questions for Abigail? Or a lot? Well, I think we'll just take one. Tim?
Thanks, Abigail, really interesting. So yeah, I'm interested in this potential movement between venues. We've seen that elsewhere. And one of the projects we're working at the moment, we're actually trying to make a retrofit, and it's been virtually impossible to seal between the police and the That's a real challenge. I mean, I'm wondering if there are some things to do with the characteristics of that space which is driving it. So if you've got increased temperature moisture pressure, that's the driver to move air between these.
The question is about drivers of the sort of incidental airflows between adjacent spaces.
So I'd say we don't have enough information here to characterise that fully, because we don't have anything from that, the car parking space and the nightclub to understand that. We do know that in the cafe, the pressurisation was off with the ventilation, so that was very much positively pulling things through when it was on. So that was something that was ventilated well, but it wasn't very well balanced. It needed tweaking, so it was getting a lot of air through. So I think there you could imagine that it would be sucking things in.